Lucy Hinadikiang, Nangjaras Gawits Kakayas Hinadikiang, Stafkawas Hinadikiang, do you Hadagang, do you Odagang, Royal BC Museum, Shangulang, Maktali Tlage, Royal BC Museum, Engo, Uijang, how Laquangan Hade. Ayat singe lauslang di tulang lagang how a dung di angudang. My name is Lucy. I'm the head of First Nations and Repatriation Department here, and I'm just so proud to be sitting amongst my very talented friends and colleagues here. To me, these are some of the true heroes of reconciliation at the museum, and it's always so great to work amongst them and to listen and learn about the work that they do. How are my friends? Okay, should we start with some questions?
I just want to thank you all for your presentations this afternoon, and also for the presenters before this. There's kind of this theme that's coming out for me this afternoon, which is all about diversity, reconciliation, but also this idea of intercultural work that we're doing. So my question to the panel is, how are we going to start integrating all of that work into everything that we do? You guys are laughing, because you know this is a passion of mine. So how are we doing that? How are we going to fulfill some of the obligations under the Truth and Reconciliation, but also just be more relevant to the people that we serve? So it's just a question.
Who would like to tackle that one?
Hire more staff.
Okay, in the absence of being able to hire more staff.
Yeah, I think the benefit is that we're certainly in recent years have been interacting with each other way more than what we did before. I mean, the archives and the museum were, you know, in two countries before, kind of thing. So there's that is a really positive change that you see that has happened recently, right? So there's much more integration of everybody here, and working with wonderful people, and the whole digitization aspect of it. Things are just growing and being done at a much faster rate. So I see things as getting much better in that regard.
And I'd like to add to that, and I think that we'll all agree that, there's an old saying, we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, and I think in terms of the Royal British Columbia Museum, that we have an extraordinary history from the people that came before us, the curators and the people in the former linguistic department, the people that had generated all this material, who one of our former colleagues, Peter McNair, for instance, had done remarkable work in bringing the Kwakwaka'wakw communities into the museum, and the museum into Kwakwaka'wakw communities. And I think one of the things that we haven't done very much, certainly when I go around to various conferences and so on, I don't think we've blown our horn enough. I don't think that people really understand the great history that we are dealing with, that we're drawing from. And I would agree with Grant that the fact that we can now all work together and communicate what everybody's doing and get that out there is a very important thing, because if First Nations realize that the whole museum is open, and it's easy to get to, and it's easy to make contact with all of us, and they're welcome all the way from the front line through to the executive, and everybody is engaged with those kind of cultural and society endeavors, that I think that would be very positive. Oh, you've got one.
I've got one.
Okay.
I'm going to hang on to this for the whole hour. I agree with a lot of what you both just said, and I think speaking about tooting our own horn, or however you say it, with having the page that we're dedicating to the work that we do in terms of making our best efforts to respond to the calls to action, having that out there in a way that people can see that this is the type of work that we do on a regular basis. We are doing it. There's always more to learn, and there's always more to do, and that's going to be changing all the time. So having a page where we can display to the world how we're doing that, and that will also, I hope, make it more interactive so that people can see what we're doing and say, well, actually, I think you're lacking, and hopefully then contact us and have more of a dialogue back and forth. And I think that is really important to make it really clear that we're open and that people can come to us and talk to us. And I think we've been trying to do that. And, you know, we've created a document, if we're thinking specifically about communicating with Indigenous communities. We've created a document that describes how to contact people throughout the museum and archives, and how to get access to different types of Indigenous collections. And it's all in one really simple, high-level document, and it's got all the contact details there. And I think just something as simple as that is really helpful.
See, I took it away from you. Yeah, I think, as I was saying, that we've already been doing, and it's obvious that we have been already responding. I think that I didn't speak about some of the future work that we've got, you know, we'd like to do. But certainly, I think with Genevieve saying, connecting and listening is so important, and I think it's fantastic that we have a First Nations Advisory Council now, because there are some projects that we've spoken about that we have in mind for the archives, but I think that all of those ideas, we can come up with recommendations, but we've got a body within the museum now who are able to look at that work and say, because we can say, we think this is a good idea, but we want to make sure that communities and also think that's a good idea. So being able to make sure that we are connecting with and the work that we're doing, we're responding in a good way, I think that's really important, and I'm looking forward to us doing more of that.
I want to give a couple of just examples of real life things that we've experienced in the discipline at large, which pertains to the museum, but also from within the museum. So, you know, thinking interdisciplinarily, possibly you've heard of the notion of Clam Gardens, which are these feature on the landscape, and for a long time, geologists were looking at them going, yeah, I just can't figure it out. Looks natural, is it natural? And about 10 years goes by, and then someone speaks to an elder who says, oh yeah, dude, they're clam gardens. And so just opening those channels of dialogue is really important. So now things like working with Comox Nation to recover pieces of a fish weir panel, and discussing things with natural history about the history of resource use in the area, and discussing things that maybe neither section had actually considered in that way. So that's one of the examples. The other that comes to mind is working with communities and building the information in our collection. So I work with the audiovisual collection a lot. I look at these photos, and a lot of them, as in archives, were labeled very vaguely and not in a meaningful way to the communities. And so we've done a lot of work. It's been an ongoing project since that collection was created, to allow community members to add their comments to the back. You know, this is my grandfather so-and-so. People can correct each other. But it's a collaborative effort. So, you know, the community is really telling us what it is that we are stewards of. So.
I have a question for Genevieve about Ida Halpern, and a question for Grant. You can ask Genevieve first. About the Ida Halpern, you said that in between the songs, there was a lot of talk, and I wondered if that was going to be transcribed and made searchable, keyword searchable, because that would potentially be the way for people to access that information without having to listen to every transcript and try to track that down. So it's just an idea. I didn't know if you were going to do it.
At the moment, we're not transcribing the audio recording word by word, so not true transcriptions. But what we have done with some of them is have we've had some community members come in. So my predecessor, Raymond Frogner, worked with 3 Kwakwaka'wakw speakers who came in and listened to recordings in that language. And then when Raymond updated the descriptions, he was able to give a much fuller description of the record that mentioned the people that they talked about. They had some ownership details and a lot more just body of what was in the song, and then also the conversations that took place in each recording. And we're going to do more of that going forward. So we're hoping to get, some of it is in English. I chose one that had some English speaking because it's nice to understand what you're listening to, but a lot of it is not in English, so we're hoping to work with other speakers, language speakers. I've had some contact with some Nuu speakers who I'm hoping might be able to help us with some of those recordings. Possibly one day we would be able to do full transcriptions, but at the moment I think the descriptions, we can make our descriptions robust enough that you can search for them and find which recordings will talk about which subject matter.
Well, that's good. And Grant, my question to you is sort of a strange one, but why does the lightning snake have legs?
One could go into the whole history of that around the Pacific Rim. What they call the dragon in the lung in early Chinese, it was actually a creature with 2 legs. It looked very similar to some of the Nuu drawings. And so there's those old marine circum-Pacific things. Later on, you see them sometimes with 2 legs, sometimes with 4 legs, and it changes over time. So they're definitely on the West Coast. In the same time period, you have a lightning snake. They all have this classic plume on the head, but one will have only 2 legs, and sometimes they'll have 4. And then sometimes they're represented as like a snake with no legs, with a really dominant head. Again, there's different versions in different areas, but the lightning snake is represented with legs and without legs, just like the dragons were. Just one thing I should add, like to finish your question there, in terms of, I'll give you an example. Every time Eric gets some publicity or something we're doing, I get phone calls from people who want to donate stuff, or it stimulates people out there, or doing a learning program. So we went out to Island View Beach, and one of the women that came on the trip had a little bag of something she wanted to show me because she had found it there last week, and it was a vertebrae of a bison, right? So she's going to donate it eventually, kind of thing, but she wants to show it to her friends first. So here we have, again, would that woman have ever come in to see me and find out we had a bison if we didn't have that learning program? And you can bet she's already told 300 of her friends about this thing that she found. And then I'm hoping we'll get a little publicity for putting online, or maybe something Eric might want to do once I'm going to invite her in here to look at other things in our collection, and so she'll be out there all the time looking while I'm in my office, and who's going to find the stuff? Not me, right? So anyway, that all of those programs we have like that, all that publicity, that all more and more of that is going to go toward what we're discussing earlier.
Hi, this might be more of a museum question, but maybe not. But I was just curious about the idea of living culture and how we facilitate that, and that Indigenous perspective of some of the cultural items maybe shouldn't be behind glass, but should be either used and go through their life cycle, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure what the question is. It's about glass, in which case we have to talk to the conservators. Ideally, things in museums aren't behind glass, but there are some things that need protection if they're going to be exhibited. We always note that it's paradox in that so much of our collection isn't on display. Certainly most of it isn't. Only about, 3-4% of the ethnology collection, and even less of the archaeology collection is on display. Also, people don't realize that as well as the Ida Halpern and the tapes in the archive collection, we have very big linguistic and ethnographic tapes in what used to be the anthropology and ethnology collections, the audiovisual collections in the museum per se. So we have this wealth of information of living cultures. And the fact that it isn't on display makes it, in a way, more accessible, which seems like a contradiction, but it isn't. Because people can come into our collections and they can make an appointment with Brian Seymour, and they can come in and work with Genevieve and so on, and handle things and pick up the hats and put them on their heads and, you know, try on the bracelets. They're quite free to do anything that doesn't really compromise the objects. So there is that possibility of access, but it is difficult in that, you know, we don't have enough people, and we have a more and more, the more success we have to let people know that it's here and we'd love to see them, the more they're going to come. And, you know, when you open the door, you can't close it. That door's got to stay open. We're not opening now and saying, oh, you know, no, oh, sorry, we made a mistake, we can't do it. We've got to do it, and we started to do it, and we really have a commitment to do it. So that's two, you know, the things on the exhibit, which have to be behind glass, are a very small percentage of things, and we would hope that they're not seen as definitive. So what was the other part of your question? Was the living culture? Oh, yes. The living, also, Grant just said, talk about loans, and we do loan things to First Nations groups. We have for a long, long time. In fact, there used to be the potlatch collection that was created in the carving program in Thunderbird Park, where our carvers, like Tim Paul and Richard Hunt and so on, would make reproductions or versions of older material in the collection, in the ethnology collection, for the specific purpose of loaning it for potlatches. And at that time, when they were doing that, there weren't a lot of people in the potlatch system that had all their regalia. So the loans were very well used. They used to be in the basement, where they weren't part of the collection, so people could come in on the weekend, pick up regalia, masks, and so on, take it up to Alert Bay and other places and bring it back to the museum when through. And gradually that collection got less use, and it's now part of the regular collection because everybody has their own regalia pretty well now. But we still loan things out both for use and for show, for potlatches and so on. So we do have a lot of access. One of the things that we need to do about the living cultures is to keep things current. And that, as far as the ethnology collection, at least where I work in, means money. Because we need to buy contemporary work, we need to access contemporary photographs for use in exhibits. We need to keep these collections up current and for tomorrow. So if we want to buy things, for instance, from First Nations artists, which we really want to do, we need to have some budgets to do that, because this is a very high value, and rightly so. It's one of the great art traditions of the world, and the values, if we want to purchase material, are very high. Luckily, we've been able to purchase for exhibits. Like for our living languages, we're privileged to be able to commission works specifically for that exhibit, and they'll be in our collection. And we hope that every exhibit we do will be able to do that. I don't know if this answers your question, Dave.
A question following, I started thinking about when you're talking about the archives, but it could apply to other things as well, is about annotation. And do you georeference things that you have, like a latitude and longitude for items that you have? Because I'm just envisioning this map where places mentioned in stories or in items or in archives or objects on this map that would integrate well with natural history collections and things like that.
We do by default. So in archaeology, most of the material that comes to us, it's recovered under a provincial permit, and sending it to a public repository is one of the rules of having those permits. So most of the material we get during the year is excavated from a known site, which will have a longitude and latitude and a nice shapefile that goes with it. So all of that data is accessible. And one of the things about the archaeology collection, which is different from ethnology, is that in ethnology, it's easy to search by cultural group. In archaeology, you have to know the Borden number of the site that you want, so it does take a certain number or a certain amount of figuring out what you want to know. So if you want to know, which site in Cowichan Bay, you'd have to tell me what longitude and latitude, and then I could figure out, and we'd search that way. So archaeology is certainly not the most user-friendly, but Grant and I do the task of doing that sort of research for people who are wondering. So we can do that for you too.
I can answer for archives in terms of, the short answer would be no. But it is something that if you wanted to do, if you knew the location, if you're saying that you wanted to include that kind of information related to the location that record came from, or the community it was speaking about, you could potentially do something digitally like that, so that you have, I've seen other historical mapping projects, especially with regards, I think there's one online for Vancouver where they've got photographs digitized and online, and you can have a look at a map of Vancouver and click and see the old photograph of that street or whatever it might be. So things like that are possible digitally for sure. In terms of the archival catalog right now, we don't have any that kind of information within the catalog, but it's partly because if you think about it from an archives perspective, it would only be relevant where, you've got records that relate specifically to a certain place, and especially that in some cases you might not have that information from the records themselves, so there's nothing that you could pinpoint it to, essentially. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, in the same vein, I think it's good to talk about some of the differences between archival records and museum objects, in that we do have items, so we have photographs and audio recordings, for example, that are one item that you can pinpoint to a spot. But our collections are at a much broader level. So for example, we describe records at the level of the collector, what we call the creator. So the Ida Halpern records are cataloged at the level of the creator of Ida Halpern. And she has a much broader collection than just one place. She lived in Vancouver. She worked all up and down Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii and large parts of the coastal part of the mainland. So you can't really pinpoint her collection. And often we describe at a higher level, and researchers come in and they dig down through the files and deeper into the records, but we often don't have the ability to describe at the item level for an entire collection. Like the Ida Halpern records, again, 17 meters of textual records, that's 17 meters of files. That's wider than this room, I think. We just can't pinpoint every location for everything that's in there. So I think in some cases it would work for certain types of records, but for a lot of the archival records it doesn't. And a huge amount of our records are government records, and those have provincial scope. Almost every box would have provincial scope to some degree, so.
Hi. I just wanted to, I've been following, in the last week there was a Matey conference in Edmonton. I've been following the issues and that they discussed there. And I know that's another province, but I was wondering if somebody here could clarify for me, what is the definition of Matey exactly? There are various definitions I've heard. And also, how will the Truth and Reconciliation affect Matey people?
Who wants to tackle that? It's a big question.
You go ahead.
Well, I'll pass this over very shortly to Grant, but it is an issue for us in our exhibits, because there are several Métis groups in British Columbia. Some years ago, we met with one of the larger groups, and we had a lovely ceremony up in where the Our Living Languages exhibit is now, but before was a bit of a black hole of empty space. And we had a very nice event there where they presented the museum. Pauline Rafferty at the time was the CEO, with an Assumption sash and a book about the Métis community, and it made it very clear that they would like to be represented in our exhibits. And the only thing that I think is Métis in the exhibit at the moment, Lauren, is that there is a bag, I think, in the fur trade exhibit that may be Métis. The problem with the material culture is that it's not immediately recognizable. So we may have bags, beaded bags in the collection that are sort of undeterminate, which may or may not be of Métis origin. So it is in one way a collecting and project, and a project of learning more about the Métis in British Columbia. I'll pass it to Grant now to tell for her definition.
I think I'll enter, rather than give you a definition, I'll enter more confusion into the picture. Okay, there was a time when people lived in St. Boniface outside Winnipeg, or I guess it's part of Winnipeg now probably. You had a Métis community, which were basically people that were half First Nations and half something else, and they played their music. They had their own kind of Pidgin, French, English, Cree language, or whatever they were, right? And so there's the defined Métis groups, right? And so you've got everything. Those are examples of classic Métis, as they've been called. Then you have people, say, in British Columbia, where fur traders came in, married local Native women, and so on a reserve, there might be the genetics. There are no male First Nation genetics in that band. However, all the women that they married, their mother's DNA is still there, and so it's a band who genetically are women, right? And there's recent studies being done on First Nations reserves in eastern Canada where there was almost no male Y chromosome. So basically these are reserves whose genetic makeup is from the female side and not from the male. So what are they, Métis? So you get in, there's all this complicated stuff to do with genetics, complicated stuff to do with history, and then you've got these people who, a few of them I've met, that First Nations find annoying, like I do. Some person who later in life learned that his great-grandmother was a Cree, and so he was what the First Nations call a wannabe. Never lived on a reserve, never even had any interaction with First Nations, but they call himself a Métis or a mountain man or something, and they're aggressively pushing their nose in, wanting to compete with First Nations for money, right? So you get this enormous diversity of groups, and there really needs to be a lot more discussion about that. The Department originally Indian Affairs, as they originally called, we're getting into these things that sound like an apartheid system in South Africa. If you're if you're 1/8 East Indian, 1/8 this, 9/10 that, you had 16 racial classifications of names, which were just plain silly, but from what we know today. So this is where there really has to be a lot of discussion about that. So there's recognition aspects of it, and then there's legal aspects of it. So how do you, who has, there's First Nations that have certain legal rights. Where do you draw the line with Métis that have legal rights? There are people who are Métis in northern BC that are mostly First Nations that have been there for hundreds of years. Those people, in my opinion, would have equal rights to any First Nation groups. But the mountain men from the cities, that's a different scenario. But how do you distinguish those? And it gets really difficult. So there's got to be a lot of discussion about this kind of thing in terms of legal things. And the museum might recognize certain Métis groups that are not recognized by the government. So it's a very complex thing that needs a lot more discussion.
Can I just respond to the part of the question that was about how we would handle that in terms of the response to the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action? As far as I understand from a legal perspective, there are 3 distinct descriptions of Indigenous people in Canadian language, which is Inuit, Matey, and First Nations. But the word Indigenous is, again, in my understanding, covers anybody of Indigenous heritage. And in the museum and archives as a whole, anyone who self-identifies as Indigenous is treated the way that they've self-identified. So it is very, very complex, as Grant said, in terms of the different ways to identify in terms of if it's political or cultural or otherwise. But here at the Royal BC Museum, if somebody self-identifies as Indigenous, then they will be believed to be Indigenous.
Erica?
This question might be a bit challenging. Yesterday, Lucy and I had lunch with a very, very smart woman who noted that there's a lot of good intention in partnership and engagement with Indigenous people, and that's acknowledged. But in order to reach true reconciliation, we need to change the communication paradigm. And everything I've heard from the panel today, and I recognize I'm part of the museum community, is still on our terms. So how would we as an organization move forward to change that communication paradigm so that we're not communicating with the communities on our terms, but on how they want to be recognized?
I have one thing to say, and that's timelines. We run into this quite a lot when we're doing exhibits, of course. We have things that we have to do at certain times, at certain places. We have expectations, we have graphs, we've got all of those things. And we know, of course, that this is sort of white guy stuff, if you want to put it that way. It's very institutional. And that's one of the big challenges that I think that we have. When we're going out to people to make collaborations, to have sincere partnerships, to listen to what they want to do, we also have to take into account their timelines and how that works. You can't just walk into a community and say, hey, by February, we need to know everything that you know about X, and we want to put it on the wall, and that's what we need. And to some extent, I don't think that any museum could function without some sort of structure. We can't say, oh, we're going to do an exhibit, but we don't know when or where or anything like that. You have to have that somehow. But somewhere in there's in my experience, I think there's something to get to that we're not at yet, and we might not even know what it is. It's a methodology that doesn't exist as far as I can see, and I think that's one of the things we're going to have to come up with, in partnership, of course, with First Nations, but it can't just be our agendas, that's for sure.
Firstly, can you just define communication paradigm?
It stuck with me from yesterday, and what aren't I loud enough without this? What we talked about is the relationship between Indigenous peoples and cultural institutions has evolved in a certain way, very much directed mostly from the cultural institutions side. And that in order to facilitate true reconciliation, we need to shift how we communicate and engage so that it's a brand new relationship going forward, as opposed to trying to make an old system work. So as an organization, are we open to that? And if we are, how would we make that happen?
Yeah, I think this topic was discussed a fair amount at the BCMA conference last year. I think that there were some really interesting sessions there. I would say that yes, I think because of, especially being a colonial institution, museums, libraries, and archives, we are Western, kind of Western-built professions, essentially, and cultural institutions. We've got that legacy. But I think it's about being humble. Like, if we were to go out and be like, we're doing this work, aren't we great? Then, yeah, that's maintaining that attitude. But if we and I think my point earlier about recognizing that we need to go to communities for support and ask them, like, we were thinking of doing this. How do you feel about that? And if they say, no, thank you, or we think it should be done in this way, or we would like to see X, then listening and stopping and listening and actually changing what we're thinking of doing. So, yeah, I think it's about being humble and being willing to, being aware that whatever we might think is, whatever our good intentions are, that actually what we've come up with might not be acceptable, or that there may be a better way of doing things, and being willing to change and listen. So yeah, so being humble and being willing to listen, I guess they're basics, and I don't have an answer, but yeah, and yeah.
And I think also that we keep talking about how we go and we ask people, which is great because a lot of those people aren't going to approach us without us asking them. So that's a good way. But there are a handful of people who do approach us, and they're the people that make me feel really uncomfortable. And I need to feel uncomfortable if I'm going to do this job well. So I just recently had somebody approach me to meet, and it was kind of scary. It made me feel really nervous. This person had some very strong feelings and opinions about what we should and shouldn't be doing. And I met with him, and it was good. And we're going to continue working together. And his ideas, in the end, they weren't actually that different than what we were hoping to do anyway. So sometimes if I step back away from my fear and just let it happen, it's okay in the end. But yeah, so welcoming in the people who are knocking down the door, and being a bit more aggressive is good too, as well as approaching the people who aren't coming forward on their own.
With regard to repatriation of ancestral remains, one of the ways that I hope that we've been achieving this reverse in the flow of dialogue is that, although we have been accessible for the return of remains, since the 90s, we have this renewed sense of purpose. And so what we've been doing is to organize ourselves in-house and to notify the communities to say, we have this material, because a lot of the time there will be a pre-existing relationship. Those people either change jobs or they pass away. So by getting our house in order and by reaching out to the community and saying, we're here and we're ready for you at your leisure, we will, when communities then are ready to undertake that really heavy and serious work, they can come to us and they know that we're open for that. So I think that's one way in which we're trying.
I would have, I think, three things I would say to that. First, the First Nations Advisory and Advocacy Committee is there, and they added advocacy to their title because they want to advocate for their communities, they want to advocate for the museum, they want to facilitate relationships. So for us to be calling on that committee a bit more, and being comfortable picking up the phone and calling up Ron Ignace because we want to talk about something from the interior. Doing a bit more of that, we can do that. The new repatriation specialist will be Luann Neal, and she's taking her time getting here because she is finishing up an indigenization plan for VIU. And she is in the process of implementing and getting that into the community. So when she gets here, I think we need to capture that knowledge from her there. And one thing that comes to me a lot in this job is something that my Nani, my grandmother, talked to me about when I was kind of making fun of Indian time and kind of putting it down. But really, and she's like, it's Haida time, and it's a good thing because we go to the river when the fish run, not when DFO says the river is open. So being open and patient with ourselves and with our Aboriginal partners that we're working with is really, really important. And to know that at the end of the day, it's okay if we're running a little bit late. It's okay if so-and-so hasn't shown up at the museum yet. It will happen when it needs to happen. Hawa, we've got a question up here that time. I know it's burning, right?
Well, yes, it is along the following lines. Valuing Indigenous heritage and engaging in reconciliation has its counterparts in other countries. New Zealand, Australia particularly come to mind. So my question is, how do we work with others in this space outside British Columbia's borders? It may be as close as Alaska, but it may be as far away as some of the Pacific Island nations, and so that we learn and benefit from that relationship.
I can speak just in terms of the research project that I've been working on. As I mentioned, one of the things we've been doing is a literature review, and obviously part of the reason for doing that is because of, Canada is not the only country that's dealing with a post-colonial context, and so a lot of the work that we've been doing is looking at what's been happening in other countries, and articles and research from other countries around the world, and especially in looking at that and saying how is that applicable to us here, not just in BC but across Canada, and then also again that group is pan-Canadian, so it's really interesting hearing just the differences from BC and to other provinces. And I think that by being involved, and certainly with the few of us here being involved in research projects that do have an international scope, you do, just from hearing from colleagues, you build partnerships and you hear about, although like for my project we've been talking about policies and protocols and these kind of things, but I'm very interested in like what's really happening within those institutions and how can we learn or apply them here. So one of the projects that was going on at the University of Manitoba is they were looking at the Library of Congress subject headings and how they might want to change those and change the language there. For example, do you still use the term Indian, or should we be changing that to Indigenous or Aboriginal? And so they've been through that whole Library of Congress subject terminology, looking at the taxonomy there. And so, I mean, that's just one research project, but looking to that work and seeing how we may or may not want to implement it here and how applicable we think it is. And also, I mean, just also by being involved in these projects, we build partnerships between institutions and cultural heritage organizations and communities. So, for example, we have been discussing with the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation and also the new Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Centre at UBC about sharing information about residential schools with those institutions, so that, again, people that want to research into residential schools are able to access more information. So it generates... It not only informs what we're doing, but it also generates more partnerships and kind of cross-provincial and national and potentially international work. And I know that both Genevieve and I were attending the ACA, the Association of Canadian Archivists conference last year, and there were some interesting talks there from archivists in the UK about, well, just that, like how does that look in the UK, and what internationally the ethical concerns for archivists and the profession. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, but you're on the spot.
No, I think that covers it.
Yeah, hi. This is so far out of my field, so forgive me if it seems like an ignorant question, but more specifically, BC it's a huge area. It's chopped up really geographically. And I understand there's how many separate languages? Over 50? Yeah. So it sort of strikes me that trying to find some kind of common ground or some kind of collection, I guess, or some kind of a big picture of this area would be similar to someone trying to have a very small group of people collect the linguistic, political, and cultural history of Europe, for instance, which, it seems overwhelming. And my question is it overwhelming? And the second part of the question is we're here at the West Coast, and of course there's a very rich history here at the West Coast, but there's a lot of tiny little places throughout the rest of the province. And are there any spots or areas that you feel are really not kind of unknown? And what do you do in a case like that? Is your budget reflect, does it allow you to actually reach out, or do you have to pretty much just sit there and wait for things to come in? Bunch of different questions.
For archaeology, we just sit and wait. We're here waiting. But it's important to understand that although we are the oldest archaeological repository in BC, most First Nations prefer to have material close to home, and so there are some repositories out in First Nation communities, and we are working to support First Nations who are hoping to develop their own repositories. So that's why some areas aren't well represented in our collection. For us, we get a lot of permitted material from Vancouver Island, the Museum of Anthropology gets a lot of stuff from that area, and so on and so on. But we don't get to go out and get stuff.
I'd like to add something from the ethnology collection viewpoint to that. A lot of what we do in museum research, and we're all talking about research. Some of us have worked in universities, some of us have PhDs, some of us don't. It doesn't really matter in museums because we're not a university. We may work around universities, we have university colleagues, we may take part in university projects, but our museum research tends to be on a different level. And part of what it is concerned with is the collections. We want to know more about the collections we have, and you've heard quite a bit about that today in terms of Ida Halpern, trying to get information from today into the collections that might have come to the museum in 1912, for instance. We still don't know enough about it. So a lot of our research goes around those collections. And the collections from the Northwest Coast are bigger than the collections from the interior in BC. And in fact, the Northwest Coast was one of the great collecting areas of the world, as you probably know. And for instance, when the Jacobson brothers were here in the 1880s and 1890s, they sent back to Berlin and other places around the world tons of material, absolutely tons of material. And there's our newspaper reports in the old colonist newspaper about boats coming in and taking thousands and thousands and thousands of objects from the Northwest Coast everywhere because everybody wanted them. So we have in our collections a bias towards the coast because of the great artistic traditions of the coast, and it was accessible for people and they wanted the material, and that's where the collecting focus was. In the interior, there's very little. There are little spots about certain collectors collected certain things at certain times, so we have fairly good collections from, say, Spence's Bridge from a certain time, but nothing from other areas at all. And it is an issue, and one of the things that I wanted to mention is the treaty negotiation process, which we are involved in. We work very closely with the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, who run that process, and we do repatriation through that process. And when we, for instance, made a repatriation to Nisga'a and more recently to Huhet, there are wonderful objects that go back. And in fact, the Nisga'a made a whole big museum, as you might know, in Lac-Gosap, to house these objects. We also get visits from smaller groups doing treaties and looking for repatriation under the treaty process from the interior. And I remember very well a group that came down, and what we had to show them was 2 baskets. They had the same sort of language in their treaties as if they were going to get something like 300 things that the Nisga'a did. But in fact, there were 2 baskets. And it was a very distressing experience for everyone, because the expectations were very high that the museum could somehow fulfill the hopes of repatriation, and people were very disappointed that we didn't have that material, and we were disappointed that we were looking at this incredibly irregular collection, which doesn't represent the province at all. So that is one of our challenges, I think, moving ahead, is to define what kind of research we're doing, how it is connected to collections, if it should be collected to collections, and just how we reach out into those areas that you talk about. It's really, for ethnology, a huge issue.
Just to speak to the archives specifically in regards to that question, the archives is the provincial repository for the government of BC, which means that we are obligated by law to take records that were created in government offices that have been appraised for full retention, meaning that archivists have gone out into the ministries and determined a small percentage. In theory, we keep 5% of all of the records created by government, or less if possible, but that's tough. So the types of records that we keep are high-level decision documents and reports and things that are hopefully, in theory, in the future will capture what the government was doing at a specific point in time. The archivists who make those decisions used to be part of the same branch as us, and now they're separate, but we work very closely with them. And that makes up a huge bulk of the records that we keep. So those records do illustrate the province as a whole. But in terms of reconciliation and Indigenous representation in those records, they come from the government perspective. So those records, Indigenous people are represented in them, absolutely, but it's from a very particular viewpoint. So we also collect what we call private records, which are any non-government records. They can come from individuals, families, organizations, companies, and those, like the rest of the museum, we do tend to have a bias towards Vancouver Island and the Lower Mainland, because especially in the past, it was just easier for people to show up on the doorstep and hand records over that were from this area. So there's definitely gaps in terms of representation of all types of people. And I just wanted to give you an idea of what we have. I don't know if I want to speak to collecting beyond that, but anyway.
I just have one thing to add to that. Where we, in terms of recent records coming into the archives, where we're offered records that we see, oh, there's potential that relates to a certain First Nation community, rather than saying like, yeah, we'll take those and bring them into the archives, we are making sure that we are consulting with the local community, because as Genevieve says, quite often there are local cultural heritage organizations where actually that might be a better place for those records to be held, because then they're more accessible to the people that want to read them and have access to them. So that's something that we're doing now in terms of new acquisitions coming to the archives. So we're making sure we're speaking with local communities as well.
And I think that wraps up our session. How dalung auth kil lagung, how aditulang. If you have any more burning questions, please do not hesitate to talk to everybody up here. And we'll hand this back to Leah. Oh, let's give this gang a round of applause, please.